Welcome to the Gentleman's Guide to Gaming. I have a question for you. The YouTube RPG Brigade has spilled over slightly into Facebook, and a few of those of us who know each other fairly well have been discussing, have more been commenting about games we've been running lately. And one thing I've noticed is that some people put a hell of a lot of effort into writing their games. Some people write their games down to the letter, and I remember when I first started running Dungeons & Dragons for the very first time, I would write pages and pages and pages. I would write my adventures out like a dungeon adventure. I would have a block of text in italics that I would read out to the players, and I would have another block of text underneath in bold that I would keep to myself. I would have other text that is descriptive should they ask for descriptions of certain things. I would have all of the monsters and all of the characters that they run into statted out, down, as I say, to the letter and the number. Every single thing that could possibly be accounted for would be down on paper. And so this would result in my going to my club with reams of paper, just in case they decide to go off the beaten track, and just so that I could be prepared for the game that I was going to run. Now, this isn't a bad way of running. It's certainly not. In fact, this is probably one of the most comfortable ways of running, because you can go in as if you have studied for an exam and you will be ready for what the players have to throw at you. It's a very comfortable, very fun way of running, and the players, seeing that you have all these notes, can feel assured that you know what you're doing. This isn't the way I've been running for the last 6 months or so, if not longer. If you have kept up with my Pathfinder recap videos that have ended, alas, due to the game finishing prematurely, you will know that at one point the players decided they would enter the Tower of Bones, which wasn't an adventure I had planned for. I had not described the inside of the tower to myself beforehand. I had no idea what they'd be coming up against. All I had was a basic background of the wizard that dwelled in the tower. So this resulted in something of a quandary for me, because at the time I had very rarely done any sort of improvisational GMing. Everything I had done was made up, was taken from paper that I'd written on, including that campaign. Up until that point, everything I had been doing was written down, either by hand or typed up. And as luck would have it, I surprised myself by running a very good adventure, even if I do say so myself. All the players really enjoyed it and were very surprised to find out that I'd made it all up on the spot. All of the monsters were made up because I just didn't have the bestiary with me at the time, I don't think. All of the rooms and the traps were made up from my head. The entire layout of the tower was made up on the spot. Now, I made it a very simple layout, to be truthful, and they didn't encounter that many different things, except for their own inter-party interaction. And that was good, although I also invented NPCs for them to interact with, and so I had to come up with them on the fly. And the point is that through improvisation, the game itself probably went better than it would have had I scripted it. And so I tried something out. The next time I ran Pathfinder, I improvised again. I had some basic notes. I knew where I wanted the characters to go. I knew where I wanted the plot to go, but I didn't write anything out in detail. And once again, the game went absolutely perfectly. The big test for me, after doing this for some time, was when I went to the UK Games Expo last year, and I ran Dark Ages Vampire, I ran 2 sessions of Hunt of the Vigil, I ran All Flesh Must Be Eaten, and all 4 of those games just had basic outlines in my head. I had no paperwork prepared. Literally all I had done was write the character sheets and give them out, and maybe a couple of handouts, but I had not written the adventure for myself. All I knew were the basic points that they had to hit in order to get to a conclusion. But the conclusion was ultimately theirs to get to. It wasn't a set ending that I had in mind, it was an ending that they could come up with. And so, with the players coming up with the ending for the game, they could feel satisfied that they had reached the conclusion they wanted, because they were improvising as well, just as much as I was, as players always do. And every single one of those games went brilliantly. Hunt of the Vigil games especially, both of them, and if you haven't watched my Hunt of the Vigil, Burnt Offerings and Mother of All Wrong Turns videos, please do check them out. I very rarely ask for subscriptions, comments, likes or anything like that because frankly, if you don't want to, don't bother, I'm not going to beg. But those are videos I would love for you to check out because the recaps of those adventures brought back to me how exciting it was to come up with everything on the spot, to improvise everything, to ad-lib everything. As soon as they encountered someone, I didn't know what they were going to say because I did not have extracts written down on a piece of paper. I improvised it on the spot based on what I felt that character would be feeling at the time. And since that time, pretty much every game I've run has been improvised. Vampire the Masquerade. The only thing I had to help me run that game was a tiny scrap of paper. I might have it to hand. Let's see. I had a tube map because it was set in London, and that chronicle that lasted 9 or 10 sessions in length, this is what I had. It is a list of names. That's all it is. And we ended up with a map of a motel. That was it for Vampire the Masquerade. And that ran for 9 or 10 sessions. And worked perfectly well. Brilliant ending. I'll have to recap it at some point properly. I know the players want me to. In fact, one of them even recorded the session on a dictaphone. But not only that, Planescape, I was running that over Skype. Now this may surprise you, Ander, if you watch this, or not. But aside from the basic outline of that game, there was no script. There were no set encounters. There were no pieces of dialogue that I was reading. And certainly all of the descriptions of all of the areas, for the most part, unless I could find it in a source book like that, I would come up with on the spot. This isn't me trying to sound good. This is me just explaining how I have been running games for the past 6 months, 7 months or so. I suppose even longer, because UK Games Expo was in the early part of June last year. And sometimes that can come back to bite you. It can especially come back to bite you in combat, because combat is my weakest area as a GM. I always struggle with combat, even if I have it all written out. In the first round, the wizard will cast this spell, in the second round, the wizard will cast that spell, in the third round, etc. But then when I do that, although it's a good way to plan, it also feels pre-programmed, like you're typing into a computer what a character's going to do, what his AI is, it doesn't matter what you throw at him, he can't fall off of the scripting that you've given him. Now, that isn't, in my opinion, how it should be. Or at least, not to me. And at the same time, if I improvise combat, it becomes hellishly chaotic because I don't necessarily have plans for what everyone's going to do. But then again, how many battles, how many wars are fought with battle plans being kept to throughout? I think Napoleon said, no something last the 5 tits. And the same applies to role-playing games. So I don't know whether there's any way I can really get around that. So now the end of the Planescape game, now who knows, one day I might recap those as well. You all be lucky, but I might. I gauge the impression that some players, perhaps, were maybe dissatisfied with the ending. But that's improvisation. I wasn't necessarily going to prepare everything that could potentially happen, because knowing my players, as I do, they inevitably wouldn't have done what I had expected anyway. And I knew, loosely in my head, how I wanted the game to end. I knew that for instance, Marglod, Duremia Higvar Valdis and Stinghamar, from my perspective, and from the Lady of Pain's perspective, and from the perspective of the Davos, and from the perspective of Dispater, the entire adventure, the entire chronicle, was an exercise in humility. It wasn't an exercise in trying to make him become human, because that wouldn't have been in keeping with the character or in keeping with the setting. It was an exercise in getting him to see the planes from a different perspective. Now, I think he certainly did, because I would say, in a manner of speaking, he found love like he never would have before had he not had that adventure. Whether it was love for Iltharin or love for Zuma, whatever the case, he found something in himself that he never had before. But it wasn't what the Lady of Pain was after. It wasn't what the Dabus were after. It wasn't what Dissipator was after. I'm not saying they were all moral, high ground types who were saying, oh, we want you to commit good deeds, we don't want you to sin. Because obviously that isn't the case. What they wanted him to do was see things from a different perspective, which was ultimately something he found quite difficult to do. And so devils, as they do, lied to get him to where he ended up at the end of the campaign. But I will say no more, because no doubt Ander doesn't want anything spoilt, and I will have to pick that up again when Planescape picks up again. So, anyway, went off the beaten track a bit there. Improvisation versus preparation. Which do you prefer and why? I prefer improvisation because I like to be stimulated like that. I like to have to use my imagination. I like to be forced into creativity. And I like to feel the pressure, the stress. I like to come up with what a character would say on the fly, just as I would have to say on the fly. I like to imagine that me and the players are on a stage, and while they may be the protagonists, I'm all the supporting cast, and they will have to approach the supporting cast to get their dialogue, to get their cues, to get their fight scenes. Do they know what the supporting cast are going to say? No, because it's improvised theatre. To me, role-playing, especially over the last year, has become increasingly like a form of improvised amateur dramatics. It has, or maybe not even amateur at times, but most of the time. And for that reason, I love the spontaneity of it. I love to feel like I am my own audience, and so are the players, and the players are their own audience as well. That everything is a challenge because everything is unexpected. And if I'm just reading off of a script, is there as much of a necessity for me as, well, is it really any different from a computer game? Maybe not. Or maybe it is. That's why I'm asking you for your opinion. And I would love to hear it. I would love to see a video response. So, by all means, do make one. Or do comment. I leave it entirely in your hands. So thank you very much for watching.